Hi everyone, welcome back to TechCravers. It's actually been a surprisingly slow start to 2026 for the handheld market. Sure, we've seen a few devices pop up here and there, but honestly, it's nothing like 2025. Last year felt absolutely insane, especially from companies like Anbernic, where it seemed like brand new handhelds were dropping every other week. But this year, things have definitely slowed down, and the reason is pretty obvious: AI, or more specifically, the insane hardware demand AI has created. Manufacturing priorities have shifted, components are harder to secure, and smaller handheld companies are clearly feeling the effects of it, which honestly makes releases like this feel even more exciting. Because instead of just another small spec bump or another recycled design, the RG Rotate actually dares to do something different. And in today's handheld market, that's becoming pretty rare. This thing looks like a strange mix between a retro handheld and an old school swivel phone, and some kind of experimental gaming device. And honestly, I kind of love it. The rotating display is obviously the big talking point here, and just from the design perspective alone, this already feels way more interesting than other handles we've seen lately. It's quirky, compact, and a little weird, but in a good way. And honestly, I'm just happy to see companies still trying new ideas instead of playing it safe all the time. But of course, a unique design also raises a lot of questions. Is the rotating mechanism actually practical? Does it feel durable? And is this thing genuinely fun to use, or is it just a gimmick? Well, that's exactly what we're about to find out. So without any further ado, let's jump into it. So first of all, let's talk about the unboxing experience, because honestly, Anbernic kind of nailed this one. The box itself is this tiny silver colored package with an almost mirror-like finish. It reflects lights everywhere, looks super clean, and immediately gives off a much more premium vibe than we usually get from Anbernic. And once you open it up, the RG Rotate is sitting there looking ridiculously classy. I've already powered it on here, and with that clock-style screensaver on the display, it genuinely feels more like unboxing a luxury watch than a gaming handheld. It's a surprisingly premium first impression, especially for something this small and quirky. Now, besides the handheld itself, here's what you get inside the box. First up, there's a screen protector included, which is always nice to see. We also get a lanyard, a USB charging cable, and interestingly enough, extra shoulder buttons. And honestly, I kind of understand why, because the installed shoulder buttons do feel a little bit plasticky and cheap at first glance. There's also a quick start manual, and finally some screen wipers to help with applying the screen protector. Overall, a pretty complete package, but more importantly, a surprisingly premium presentation for such a weird little handheld. And before we get into actual experience of using the RG Rotate, let's quickly go over the specs. And yeah, this is definitely one of those handhelds where the design is doing most of the talking, because internally this is actually fairly familiar territory. The RG Rotate is powered by the Unisoc Tiger T618 chipset, paired with a Melody G52 GPU, which at this point has become something of a classic in the retro handheld space. You're also getting 3 gigs of RAM and 32 gigs of internal storage expendable via microSD. The display is a 3.5-inch square touchscreen with a 720x720 resolution, which is obviously one of the more unique aspects of this device, and definitely something we'll have to talk about more later. Battery capacity comes in at 2000 mAh, which is definitely on the smaller side compared to a lot of recent handhelds. It's running Android 12 out of the box, supports Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, and of course the big feature here is that rotating display mechanism. And honestly, the specs themselves aren't really the main attraction here. The RG Rotate is all about the design, the form factor, and whether this unusual concept actually works in real-world use. So with the specs out of the way, let's finally talk about the design and build quality. Alright, let's take a closer look at the RG Rotate itself. First of all, this is the silver aluminum version, which is definitely the more premium option. There's also a cheaper black plastic model available if you prefer something a little more understated, or just want to save some money. But honestly, I kind of feel like this handheld almost works more as an accessory or a design piece than just a gaming device, so in this particular case I actually think the aluminum version makes a lot of sense. Because once you hold it in your hand, it really does feel surprisingly premium. The cold aluminum finish and compact shape, the rotating display, it all gives the device a very different vibe compared to most other retro handhelds out there. It almost feels more like some experimental tech gadget or luxury pocket device than a traditional emulation handheld. Now, moving around the device, the shoulder buttons are unfortunately still one of my early concerns here. Just like I mentioned before, they feel very plasticky, and more importantly, they sit almost completely flush with each other. So distinguishing between R1 and R2 or L1 and L2 without looking can actually be surprisingly difficult. It's one of those things that might not sound like a huge deal on paper, but during gameplay, muscle memory matters a lot, so definitely something worth keeping in mind. Another slightly strange design decision is the speaker placement. The RG Rotate only has one speaker and it's located on the back of the device, right above the Anbernic logo. And weirdly enough, that happens to be exactly where I naturally rest my right index finger while holding the handheld. So without even thinking about it, I constantly ended up muffling the audio output. Maybe that won't be an issue for everyone depending on how you hold the device, but for me it became a surprisingly noticeable problem almost immediately. Now with the display rotated out, we can finally talk about the controls, and honestly there isn't a huge amount to say here from the design perspective. Everything is very flat, very low profile and very clicky, which obviously makes sense considering all of this has to fit underneath the rotating display mechanism, so compromises were always going to happen. And aesthetically, I actually think it looks very clean, the minimal layout works well visually and it gives the whole handheld a very sleek and compact appearance. But unfortunately the D-pad is probably my biggest issue with the entire device. It gives way too many false diagonal inputs. I constantly found myself accidentally pressing down when I really meant to go left or right, and once you notice it, it becomes very hard to ignore. And for slower retro games, maybe that won't bother you much, but the second you jump into games that require tight and precise movement, something like Celeste for example, it honestly becomes borderline unplayable at times. You end up fighting the D-pad instead of the game itself, which is obviously not what you want from a handheld like this. Now maybe some people will adapt to it over time, but personally this is one area where I really wish Anbernic had gone back and redesigned things a little more before release. Now one thing I was honestly a little worried about before testing the RG Rotate was of course the swivel mechanism itself, because whenever you introduce moving parts into a handheld, especially something this compact, durability immediately becomes a big question mark. But surprisingly, this thing actually feels really solid. During my testing, I've probably opened and closed the display a couple of hundred times by now, and I haven't noticed any looseness, wobbling or weird sounds developing over time. The mechanism still feels tight, smooth and reassuringly stable, and honestly I'd go as far as saying that this feels more durable than most clamshell hinges I've tested on handhelds recently for sure. There's a nice resistance to it and it never really feels fragile when rotating the screen around. Now obviously long-term durability is something only time can truly answer, but based on my experience so far, this is actually one of the better executed parts of the entire device. Now since this is an Android-based handheld, anyone familiar with Android will feel at home pretty much immediately. Navigation is simple, everything is easy to access and setting things up is fairly straightforward. But weirdly enough, Anbernic decided to save money by not including a dedicated RG launcher button. You know, the button that normally opens their emulation frontend directly. So instead, unless you install something like Emulation Station and launch everything from there, you actually have to swipe down the quick menu in Android and manually press RG launcher every time. It's a little quirky, definitely not the most elegant solution, but honestly it works fine once you get used to it. Now when it comes to pricing, the RG Rotate actually feels pretty reasonable. The black plastic version comes in at around $88, while the silver aluminum model costs about $108, so roughly $20 more for the premium materials. And honestly, I actually think that's fair for a handheld this unique. Because while I absolutely would not force my worst enemy to play something like God of War Chains of Olympus on PSP here by emulating analog sticks with the touchscreen, it's still genuinely impressive seeing just how well games like that can run on something this tiny. And at the end of the day, that's kind of the charm with the RG Rotate. It's weird, compromised and a little impractical at times, but also incredibly fun and surprisingly impressive for its size. So after spending quite some time with the RG Rotate, I honestly came away liking it a lot more than I expected. The design is easily the highlight here, it's unique, genuinely premium in the aluminum version and honestly just fun to use and interact with. The swivel mechanism feels surprisingly durable, the form factor is super compact and overall this thing just has a ton of personality. But at the same time there are definitely compromises. The D-pad really struggles with precise inputs, the shoulder buttons feel cheap and the speaker placement is honestly just strange. So if you mainly play fast-paced games that demand precision and accuracy, this probably isn't the handheld I'd recommend. But for slower retro games, RPGs, puzzle games, Game Boy, SNES and arcade stuff, honestly I can absolutely see myself using this regularly. Because at the end of the day, the RG Rotate isn't trying to be the most powerful or most practical handle out there, it's trying to be different, and honestly, I'm really glad it exists. But anyway guys, let me know what you think about the RG Rotate down in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe, and maybe even ring that notification bell so you don't miss future handheld reviews here on TechCravers. Now, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.